Hi everyone, welcome back to the Art of Save Scumming, and today we're talking about the Skaven. And specifically, I just kind of wanted to do a quick one on how I was feeling about the Skaven. You know, we're sort of expecting maybe a little bit of a DLC or a rework, supposedly with Thankwall. We've seen some quotes in the pre-battle stuff from Thankwall. I think that he is basically one of the only things that's missing from the Skaven. And I wanted to talk quickly about the Skaven, where they're at after Omens of Destruction, where Skrolk is, and what I think could be messed with a little bit to bring them into Warhammer 3, because the Skaven are still a pretty powerful race. I don't think that anybody can argue with that, but because of power creep, they've come off of their what I would say highest spot. I would say in Total War Warhammer 2, they were the most powerful factions on the map. You could argue that Khorne is probably the most powerful now, but I mean, it really depends on playstyle. So I'm still having no trouble just absolutely wrecking everybody in Lustria right now. But when it comes to the Skaven in general, I think that there are just a couple things that could probably be tweaked a little bit that would bring them up to speed. So the first thing that I would like to point out is the Warlock Engineer. The Warlock Engineer, in my opinion, is slightly less powerful than your other engineers in the game, namely like the dwarves and the humans, the Empire, because they do not have the restock ability. In both the Empire engineers and the Dwarven engineers, we have the restock ability. And I don't know that the Warlock Engineer actually needs the restock ability. They have the increased mobility thing, they have the reload reduction time, they have the extra ammunition, and they have the missile strength, they have the speed. Where is it? Here. Speed, extra range, and explosive damage, right? Yeah, explosive damage and armor-piercing damage. Yeah, so they have that, but they do not have the restock ability. So as far as utility is concerned, they are, yes, less utility-focused than the standard engineers from the other races. However, they are casters. They have access to the lore of Ruin. So that kind of puts them closer to par. But when it comes to Warlock Engineers, generally speaking, I'm not using their casting ability. I'm putting them in the army because I want that army to move more, and I'm wanting that army to be able to shoot longer. And when I do use their abilities, as far as their casting ability is concerned, it's usually Howling Warp Gale overcasted for the purpose of locking down flying units so the rattling guns and the Jezzails can blow them out of the sky, right? That's just kind of how I use them. Your mileage may vary. But because of that, because they do not have that restock ability, I would consider them inferior to the other engineers in the game. And to get a Warlock Engineer, both of the other engineers in the game are acquired, their capacity is acquired at tier 3. To get a new Warlock Engineer, you have to get this building chain up to tier 5. Now, if we look at that, it's not that difficult to get to tier 5 with Skaven. I mean, come on, I'm at turn 23 and I've got one tier 5 settlement there. I'm about to capture this one over here. It'll be a tier 5 settlement. And then this is a tier 5 settlement, right? So we were there. It's pretty easy to do that. But when we look at the cost of getting this building up to tier 5 in two ways, the amount of turns that it takes to get there is 3 plus 4 is 7 plus 5 is 12. 12 turns to get there, and then the expense is 2250 plus 3600 plus 7200 to get just to get a new Warlock Engineer. So to increase your capacity by 1, that's pretty expensive to get what I would consider an inferior character to what else is going on. Now, of course, they do have the utility of expanding under cities, like we have over here. So, I mean, that's another ability that they're using on campaign map. But I would also argue that now you are deciding whether to use this finite resource as a campaign map agent or in your armies. And that's a hard call, especially in the early game, on whether you should be doing that. Now, we do also have the Scheme of Doom that it gives us a new Warlock Engineer every 30 turns, but that's also pretty expensive as far as waiting on that expansion. You basically have to do this route with the Warlock Engineer. So what I would like to see happen is maybe just knock this down to tier 4. And I feel like that is a reasonable point. I understand not taking it all the way down to tier 3, but knocking it down to tier 4 because it's considerably easier to get to tier 4, both as far as, you know, building up from scratch and then also the cost. Like, these two together cost less than this one by itself. You see what I'm saying? Now, there are ways to reduce that, and we do have this on, which decreases the construction cost by 10% in this region. So it's even more expensive if you don't have that on. So bringing that into balance with the rest of the factions that have engineer access, I think would be a reasonable ask for CA to do. The other thing they could do is leave it alone and add the restock ability, I suppose. Because then having a caster lord that has campaign actions like the expand under Empire and that utility in an army, yeah, okay, now I see that is now a superior character, and that would warrant a tier 5 probably expansion of the capacity. So I'll buy that. In my opinion, there's only like a couple units that really need to be added. I think that most of those would make a lot of sense adding with a Thankwall. Like the Storm Fiends, for instance. There's a couple characters like Lurk Snitch Tongue, and I forget off of the top of my head his little nearsighted buddy, Thankwall's little nearsighted buddy. And of course, we have to add in Bone Ripper. We know that we have demons in the game, so Vermin Lords make sense to have in the game in some form or fashion. Specifically for Skrolk, I've got two things to say about Skrolk in this campaign. First of all, the fact that the pestilens still just gets a 15 turn reduction on its pestilence scheme, and that's it, is a serious disservice to Clan Pestilence. So, I mean, we're talking in the books, the Gotrek and Felix books, Skaven Slayer, for instance, Clan Pestilence had literally broken into a temple of Nurgle and stolen one of their sacred artifacts. And this is all they got that's plague themed. The idea that they don't have a plague button like Nurgle does with completely different plagues or even the same plagues doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, I do like that their plague, for instance, does positively impact their armies, but there's also another thing that needs to happen when it comes to the plague units themselves. It used to be in Warhammer 2 that when you launched a Skaven plague, and this might have even been in the initial of Warhammer 3, if I remember correctly, maybe. If you had plague units like a plague priest or plague monks or plague monk sensor bearers or any of the kind of designated clan pestilence units like plague claw catapults, for instance, they were immune to Skaven plague. So this army, for instance, if I were to march it into a plague playing as one of the other factions, not Clan Pestilence, but if I were to be playing as Clan Scryer and I had this army, then these units here would be immune from plague. These units would not be immune to plague here. And they would all suffer attrition. These units would not suffer attrition whatsoever. That needs to be added back into the game because I think that paired with the plagues would be very beneficial to making it more thematic, because really there's no reason, even as Clan Pestilence, to run your... Where are they? They're gotten from the plague. There's no reason to run this unit. It has an armor of 10, a leadership of 68, melee attack 28. It's not really that great of a unit, especially when you compare it to like this. that's a better unit. This unit, by contrast, considerably better, right? The sensor bearers are where it's at. But again, that's a tier 5 unit. We expect that to be good. But for a tier 3 unit to not really be able to compete with a tier 1 unit in a clan rat, nah. I get that they've got frenzy and all that sort of stuff, but there's no real reason to recruit this when I have to have a special military building that's expensive. I'm already building this to get to my chieftains. So having these and globally recruiting these ultimately becomes cheap and easy. Globally recruiting these, not so much. I don't see the utility in these, and they could bring that into balance pretty easily simply by changing that around a little bit. Or I suppose they could make the sensor bearer a tier. They could make the sensor bearer, hang on a second. Let's go back here. They could make this a tier 2 unit and make the sensor bearer a tier 3 unit. And then, well, that changes the whole conversation. Then that is a substantially better unit at the lower tiers. But really, as it sits right now, I'm not seeing the clan pestilens currently is feeling flat. The plague mechanic for all of the Skaven seems not impactful, especially compared to all the other stuff that already exists in the game that would be pretty easy to implement here. And that would give people a reason to play Skrolk, other than I really like his starting position, because once you've taken this, you basically don't go any farther north, right? So I'm going to take out the sacred pools here just so that I don't have them on my doorstep. I'm not going any farther north. I've got the Dark Elves right here. I've got all this territory that I can use to build up. I'm going to invade the lower Chaos Wastes, take out Oxyotl, so now I don't have anything to worry about down here. I'm going to sell all that territory to Kairos over here. I'm going to set up a whole bunch of undercities through the expansion mechanic in his space, use that as food, and then I'm going to hop in this sea lane over here, wherever it is, right here, and I'm going to go over to Cathay because the AI can't use sea lanes, and I'm just going to wreck this whole area. I'm just going to raid it constantly, not actually go into raid stance, but I'm just going to go in there and sack everything that I possibly can for as long as I can and bump that economy through the roof, and then I can build all of my territory back at home to the point where I can support now 3 or 4 of those awesome armies like this, these weapons teams armies, and then I'm going to march north and gobble up the rest of Lustria, all of this, Ulthuan, and go as far as I care, because at that point in time, I'm just steamrolling. So when it comes to Skrolk's campaign, I would say that the other concern that I wanted to sort of consider, and that's why I started this whole thing with Skrolk, is we just had a major legendary lord, arguably one of the most powerful legendary lords to ever be added into the game, right on his doorstep. How does that impact his campaign? Well, you can see here that actually it is beneficial to my campaign, because it's pretty easy, actually, as long as you're doing well, to get an alliance with him. In fact, I could get an alliance with him probably pretty easily if I could just generate a little bit of money. So what that does is actually makes my northern border considerably more secure, because he's going to be here, and he's going to be at war with my next northern enemy, which is going to be Bordello. Now, I played this campaign twice, and in the first campaign, Bordello came down this way, but he was still at war with Skulltaker, and pretty much Skulltaker was working him over in every single engagement. So it really wasn't that big of a deal. And we also have to consider that Bretonnia really isn't built for work in Lustria. They don't have an underway stance, so they can't move through the area rapidly. They are a horse-based or cavalry-based faction, so they don't really do well taking major settlements. And the Skaven are the best at holding major settlements. You just get your warp bombs, you take a trash army of like clan rat spears, maybe a couple storm vermin, some missile units. Put them inside there. Put them in maybe even ambush stance in front of it. Let them come in. Let them attack you, and just work them over. If you have to fight inside the settlement, you got all the towers. You got the warp bombs. You can machine gun them like that. They can't really do a whole lot to you, and they might throw 2 or 3 stacks at you. You gun them down, and they're going to go away for a little while. And while they're dealing with you, Skulltaker is moving into their territory. So they're not really a threat. Whereas before, once you came into this area and you were dealing with these minor factions in this area, you opened up a huge frontage against them, and now you're fighting field battles against Bretonnia. But there's a lot of trees, so they don't do well in the trees. You also don't do well in the trees because your weapons teams don't really do well in the trees. So this defensive position right here, because these are river based, they can't really go. They could come here and turn left here and then move down this way if they wanted to. But for instance, if you hold this settlement, that's a minor settlement, actually. Salupek. Yeah, there we go. You're holding this position. They have to come down through here. So I've just chosen to let these minor Skaven deal with this, and then hold this position. So I'm not going any farther north. Anyway, so I would say that Skrolk in general is still doing great in his campaign, but there are a few things that could be done to bring the Skaven fully into the modern Total War Warhammer 3, and they wouldn't be all that hard to implement. And I want to know what you guys think about this in the comment section down below.